This is Whisper from History, where forgotten voices rise again. Stalin's Human Zoo, where people were never seen as human. A story so shocking it's hard to believe, yet it is the truth. Join us as we uncover this dark chapter of history, and stay with us till the very end. Moscow, the late 1930s. The city stood as the gleaming capital of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Empire, a land that promised equality and progress to the world. On the surface, Stalin projected the image of a fatherly leader, a man of the people who claimed to champion workers and peasants. Yet hidden behind this facade was a darker truth, one of the most disturbing experiments in human history, a project that has since slipped into the shadows of memory. It was Stalin's so-called Human Zoo, a display that revealed the cruelty and inhumanity at the very core of his rule. The idea began not with Stalin himself, but with the warped fascination of Soviet scientists who sought to prove the superiority of socialism and the Soviet race. In an age when Europe's colonial powers had already begun dismantling their degrading exhibitions of indigenous peoples in cages, Stalin's government took a step backward into barbarism. Across the world, human zoos had been popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Paris, London, even New York had once hosted exhibitions of exotic men and women from Africa, Asia, and the Arctic. These spectacles fed the prejudices of Western audiences while reducing human beings to curiosities. By the 1930s, most of the civilized world condemned such displays. But in Stalin's Russia, the obsession was reborn for political use. The Soviet regime saw science as a weapon of ideology. Anthropologists and biologists, under state pressure, were ordered to collect, categorize, and showcase specimens of humanity from across the vast Soviet Empire. Nomadic Cossacks, Siberian tribes, and people from the Caucasus Mountains were stripped of dignity and placed on display in Moscow exhibitions meant to educate the masses. They were forced to live inside artificially recreated villages, dressed in traditional costumes, and stared at by throngs of Soviet citizens as though they were animals behind glass. The most shocking element of this program was the attempt to prove Stalin's vision of a new Soviet man by contrasting so-called primitive peoples with the model Soviet worker. Families were transported against their will from their remote homelands and placed in degrading enclosures. Children, confused and terrified, were made to perform daily routines while thousands of visitors filed past to watch them eat, work, and sleep. Archival reports describe how Soviet citizens, many of them poor peasants themselves, wandered through these exhibits in stunned silence. For them, it was both fascinating and horrifying, a chance to witness cultures they had only heard about in propaganda, but framed in a way that declared their inferiority. What Stalin had created was not science, nor education, but humiliation on a grand scale. Some accounts suggest that Stalin himself visited these exhibitions. The dictator, who spoke endlessly about the strength of Soviet diversity, showed a cold detachment as he inspected the displays. For him, this was proof of control, the empire's vast mosaic of peoples reduced to specimens, all bent under his power. It was a chilling message that every man, woman, and child was subject to the state's gaze, stripped of individuality and displayed as property. Survivors who later spoke about their experiences described the lasting trauma. Siberian families who had been transported to Moscow recalled the way strangers pointed and laughed at them. Some were mocked for their clothing or their language, while others were photographed like rare animals. Many never returned home. They were relocated permanently, their old lives erased by force. The Human Zoo was not just about ethnic minorities. Stalin's obsession with proving his vision of humanity led to grotesque experiments in biology. In the 1920s and 1930s, Soviet scientists, under political pressure, had even attempted to crossbreed humans with apes. A program that failed but revealed the regime's willingness to treat human life as expendable in the pursuit of ideology. Though that experiment collapsed, the human zoo exhibitions carried forward the same disturbing principle, that human beings were tools, props for a spectacle that glorified the state. As the Great Terror swept the Soviet Union in the late 1930s, when millions were arrested, executed, or vanished into the gulags, the human zoo became one more forgotten atrocity drowned in blood. Records were destroyed, memories silenced. Those who had worked on the project either vanished in purges or kept their silence to survive. In official Soviet history, it was never mentioned. Unlike Stalin's other crimes, the famine in Ukraine, the gulag camps, the purges of intellectuals, this one faded almost completely from public knowledge. But fragments of the story survived. Western visitors to Moscow occasionally reported whispers of strange exhibitions. Later, when Soviet archives opened briefly in the 1990s, documents confirmed that such displays had been real. They revealed photographs of children from Central Asia inside educational enclosures, and descriptions of staged performances where minority groups were forced to act out rituals for Soviet crowds. For the victims, there was no justice. Most of their names are lost to history. They were peasants and villagers who lacked the power to speak for themselves, swept into Stalin's machine, and then discarded. Their humiliation was never acknowledged, their stories barely told. Today, the memory of Stalin's human zoo is a chilling reminder of how easily human dignity can be stripped away when power demands it. What was dressed as science, education, and progress was nothing more than degradation, a spectacle that robbed men, women, and children of their humanity. In the grand narrative of the 20th century, where Stalin's crimes already form one of the darkest chapters, this atrocity remains among the least known. Yet it reveals perhaps more clearly than anything else the nature of his rule. To Stalin, people were not individuals. They were not lives with value. They were objects, pawns in experiments, statistics in 5-year plans, or specimens in cages. In the shadow of the Kremlin's towers, in a Moscow filled with propaganda and parades, human beings once lived behind barriers, reduced to little more than exhibits. And while the world remembers gulags, famines, and purges, the image of Stalin's human zoo, the forgotten atrocity, lingers as a ghost of humiliation. Buried deep in the silence of history, whenever gulags and purges are remembered, this story is often left in silence. But Stalin's human zoo reminds us that when humanity itself is caged, life and dignity both are destroyed. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to our channel Whisper from History and become part of our Dark History series. This was Stalin's human zoo, part of our Dark History collection. But the shadows don't end here. In this playlist, you'll uncover more untold stories, equally chilling, equally unforgettable. So keep watching the Dark History playlist, and subscribe to Whisper from History, where every whisper reveals a shadow the past tried to hide. This video is narrated by an AI voice, script and editing done by human.